Hey, what's going on, guys? It is Blake here from the Avid Entries, back once again with continuation of Shadows Before Dawn. That's right, I said I wanted to try and get out 3 chapters this week, 3 chapters every week actually, and we're still at the intro, sort of the preface, kind of briefly going over the backstory of the author. And yeah, I kind of wanted to get the whole preface section out of the way as soon as possible. Normally I would not really want to upload each chapter you know, within the following day of the previous chapter. Like, I don't want to do consecutive daily uploads for each chapter. Like, I kind of want there to be maybe a 1 or 2 day gap during the week before I upload the next chapter, just to allow more time to sort of think about what we just read, I guess. This is actually a big one. This chapter is quite long. This chapter is quite long, so it might take me a little bit longer to get through this one, maybe possibly 30 minutes. The thing is, I may have to read a little bit faster. I'm recording this pretty early in the morning. It's actually 6:17. I'm realizing that, like, this is honestly probably the best time for me to record, because it's quiet and yeah, there's just not a lot of background noise. I don't have to worry about being bothered. What was I going to say though? But yeah, one thing I forgot to touch on in the first part, in the last video, was this format. So I am recording in my room using a webcam, my studio mic, which I have used for an audiobook in the past. But going forward, you know, next week and the following weeks throughout the rest of the book, I would really like to not only be in here. I'm not sure when I'll have like time to record in the house with like my high quality camera in a different space. I really don't like doing this in here with this webcam. I would like to do it somewhere. Even outside would be really nice. I think I can maybe arrange that somehow next week sometime if the weather is nice, or maybe the week after that, sometime in September. But yeah, don't expect every single upload to be in here with this nice sounding mic. Eventually I'm gonna probably try and switch to my DSLR camera and record elsewhere in a more pleasant environment, I guess you could say. But yeah, without further ado, we're gonna get on to the next chapter. This is chapter 2, sort of continuing the preface, continuing the backstory of the author. And yeah, this is gonna be a long one, so hold tight. But I'm gonna see if I could get back to... Oh, camera doesn't want to focus. Come on, camera, focus. Focus. There we go. I'm gonna see if I could get back to the comfortable position I was in last time. All right. So chapter 2 is called Nature, Nurture, Nowhere. All right. Moving to an unsettling setting. Are we good? I think we're good. All right. When I was very young, my parents accepted a job as forest rangers in Utah. We lived in a tiny two-room guard station cabin with no electricity, no indoor plumbing, and an outhouse deep in the Rocky Mountain wilderness. My childhood was spent there, where those early summer days fed off of time, stripping light and darkness alike from the sky in lazy cycles. Every morning, the sun rose, kissing the tips of each rolling hill as if trying to suck the life from them. The grassy knolls of the west. Hang on a sec. Some water. I am like very slightly sick, like 5% sick, but it's a little virus just passing through, so I might need to stop for water. Okay. This was a place where animals were not in cages and people were not stuck behind concrete and glass. Neighbors... Oh my god, the pages are all stuck. I hate having to do that. Here we go again with this. Neighbors became precious to you simply because they were so few and far between. But to me and my family, Utah was never an idyllic place. Once we settled in, we found that the society and our surroundings were rather harsh and unforgiving. Winters covered the sagebrush and skin alike with a dry cold so deep that life itself turned numb and silent. I saw grown men turn as callous as the hands they worked with, beaten into a state of crudeness where all elements of mercy were lost. Not surprisingly, the women were disintegrated in the face of this intense harshness. I could see them try to muscle up an impression of grace where it was better not to be born a girl in the first place. I know now that those women and girls clung to religion as the only means to cope with the insensible cruelty of this life, as they attempted to extract at least a few drops of meaning, purpose, and control out of the seemingly constant tragedy. From a very young age, I found out the hard way what those women already knew. To live without God in Utah was to live alone as prey, because the laws of that society, it's insular? Okay, yeah, I guess so. It's insular prospective rules and suppressive roles were as harsh as the laws of nature. Eat or be eaten. That sounds creepy. Okay, so the new segment, not new chapter, this is the segment, Making the Wilderness Work. Nonetheless, I was a child. This was our new home, and I was blissfully unaware of what all was to come. When I was almost 4, my brother was born, a gorgeous baby boy with platinum blonde hair and bright blue eyes. My mother was not extrasensory, unlike me. My brother was not extrasensory, unlike me. He was happy, playful, never fussy, and I can't read today for some reason, and insatiably outgoing. Unlike me, my brother did validate my mother, both as a person and as a mother. I gotta switch. Holding this with one hand is kind of difficult. Especially when my carpal tunnel starts acting up. That's why I think his birth drove an even deeper wedge between my parents and me. Now I had an emotionally inaccessible father, a mother who I felt hated me, and a brother who did not fit into the family, so I felt more ostracized than ever, truly all alone. I felt like something was wrong with me, and I was stuck in a family of people I didn't belong with. I began to fantasize that the beeswaxes were real. That's once again the family, or the name of the family that her parents used to joke that she was actually the child of, that I mentioned in the last chapter, or I would say. I imagined that my father was an overprotective, wealthy lawyer in New York City, that my mother was a beautiful, artistic, warm, exotic opera singer, and that somewhere in their posh Manhattan apartment, which was covered with silk, satin, and velvet decor, they were struggling with their hippie daughter, who wanted to wear high-top sneakers and braid her hair in 2 braids, and who wouldn't stop talking about saving the whales. Surely this girl and I were switched at birth. I dreamed that one day there would be a knock on the door, and that finally, having discovered the mix-up, each of us would be returned to the family we truly belonged with. Needless to say, that didn't happen. Had the conditions been different, I think that life at the wilderness cabin would have been a wonderful way to grow up. In fact, I loved it there. There's simplicity and a sense of undisturbed peace that comes from living a life removed from the static hum of electricity in the walls and absent from the distraction of modern technology. As such, I found ways to love my surroundings despite the isolation. Nature was all around us. We made the most of the forms of entertainment that we had, enjoying family meals, games of make-believe, animals, and hobbies. In the beginning, before school started, my life was full of meaning and richness. Raising us in this way was the best decision my parents could have made, except for one thing. When my parents moved to Utah, they did not consider the pervasive religious atmosphere of the state. New section. Living among people with strict religious rites. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also called the Mormons, or LDS, had made Utah one of the most religiously, I always have difficulty pronouncing this word, homogeneous states in the nation. It's not a Sunday religion, rather, it's a culture that permeates every second of every day of its members' lives. As long as the doctrine is agreed upon and no questions are asked, it's a culture of family and community. But the community we had moved into soon began to notice that they weren't seeing my family or me at sacrament meetings. Before long, rumors about my extrasensory abilities were spread by word of mouth around the town. Given that I was born to liberal hippies, I didn't conduct myself in the way a typical female child from the Mormons was raised to act. Long story short, I was not received well in the community at all. After aggressive attempts to convert my family didn't work, the majority of the people in town just made it a deliberate point to not interact with us. In most cases, their children were not allowed to play with me, and they would not allow me to enter their houses. I was often singled out in the parking lot after school and informed of the consequences of following my parents' impious choices. I was told that the life my family led was an impure one without hope of salvation. If it were left at that, I could have fared much better than I did, but there was another wrinkle. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints professes to be the one true church, and they believe God's true word and priesthood can only be passed down through its founder, Joseph Smith, making all other religions the religions of false prophets. Spontaneous healings and interactions with these with things beyond the veil known and practiced in the Mormon faith. Any kind of extrasensory gifts were thought to be, in fact, a potential gift of priesthood passed down from God to Joseph Smith, and from Joseph Smith to the baptized and devout. Here's the catch. Priesthood could only be passed from God to Joseph Smith to a man. So when rumors began to spread in the summer of 1988 that there was a young girl in town who was exhibiting these very same abilities, what I could do was not seen as a gift of the divine. My abilities were seen as a gift from the devil. I will say that, for the most part, Mormons seem to subscribe to a turn-the-other-cheek philosophy when it comes to outsiders. But like most religions, the LDS Church has splinter groups. One example of a splinter group is the fundamentalist LDS, who have been at the heart of a number of scandals played out in mainstream media, particularly given their beliefs of polygamy, and how often those beliefs bleed into the practice of pedophilia. There is a seldom recognized splinter group called the Blood Covenant. The Blood Covenant believes that it is their God-given mission to rid the earth of evil. They believe that the LDS Church's original teachings on the blood atonement, and in the Blood Covenant, it is accepted that sins should be paid for with the blood of man. These two beliefs led the group to infiltrate local satanic covens with the intent of undermining them and holding counter rituals. It also leads the Blood Covenant members to participate in sadistic and, oh boy, I don't know how to pronounce this one, sadistic and masochistic ritualistic acts under the belief that in suffering you find the light of Christ, and through bloodletting you are cleansed of your sins. Interesting. The Blood Covenant. I've never heard of that before. Very interesting. I have to look that joint up, that's for sure. So, new segment. The dark journey of my soul begins. In 1989, I was invited to visit the home of a girl who attended the same kindergarten class that I did. Her father was a member of a satanic coven in the area, and it was there that I caught attention of Doc. Okay, so here's where it gets kind of real. I'm assuming this is going to get pretty graphic, so yeah. Doc was in his 50s or 60s at the time. Unbeknownst to my mother, he was a member of the Blood Covenant, and he had infiltrated a local satanic coven. Years later, when I was older, I came to realize that Doc was a sociopath with multiple personalities, but the only personality that most members of the community saw, including my parents, was a super intelligent, charismatic, and successful do-gooder type. Because of his multiple personalities, however, Doc lived a double life. On the one hand, he was a likable, smart, local health expert who was obsessed with the study of the human mind, and on the other hand, he was a sadistic psychopath who attended cult rituals in his spare time. I don't know if he and my parents had officially met before this point, but Doc quickly developed an obsession with the idea of possessing me. He followed me into his truck when I was riding my pink Huffy bike alone one day, pulled me off the bike, oh my god, and raped me for the first time inside a local Mormon steakhouse, church house. He placed me back on my bike, but I was bleeding, and I was in so much pain and shock that I couldn't ride the bike straight. I pulled the bike off to the side of the road and ran into a field where I sat for who knows how long, feeling like my reality had just collapsed. I figured that what had happened was punishment. I thought that I was in trouble for riding my bike around the steakhouse parking lot until that moment. Until that moment, I had believed that my parents were like Santa Claus and would swoop out of nowhere to rescue me from danger. But that day, I realized that my mom and dad couldn't protect me from everything, and that I was alone in a very dangerous and brutal world. That was the day my childhood ended and some distorted version of adulthood began. I was only 6 years old. From that point on, Doc set up a plan to regain access to me. When I was still 6, he managed to corner me at a horse lesson and turn my world upside down again. He held me by my throat up against a wall of a stable and told me that he was my real father. He said that I was a demon that had taken the place of my parents' real child, and he warned me that if anyone found out that I had done this, I'd be taken away from them and that no one could save me from that fate but him. Doc informed me that if I told anyone about who I really was or what he had said to me, my whole family would be killed. Even at that young age, I was used to being a silent, strong, personally accountable type of child, so I assumed that it was all my fault and I had done something wrong that day to deserve the interaction. I said nothing to my parents about it because I had no reason to disbelieve what Doc had said. I was terrorized by the idea that he would, in fact, retaliate against my family as he had promised, if I were to tell anyone about him. One thing that stands out to me here is I actually didn't know she was this young when all of this happened. Like, I thought she was, I don't know, like 10 or 11 or 12, but she was 6. Like, that's crazy. That makes a lot more sense. Makes a lot more sense that she was actually this young when all this was happening. So yeah, that's kind of crazy. All right, so new segment. Mentor or opportunist. Later that week, the vice principal of my grade school came into my classroom. She said that the school had received a note from my parents saying I was going to be picked up after roll was called. They asked me if I needed someone to walk, or they asked me if I needed someone to walk with me out to the parking lot to get picked up. I said no, and once roll was called, I took my backpack and walked out of the school to the parking lot. Lo and behold, it was not my parents waiting in the car, it was Doc waiting in his truck. Yikes, dude. That was the beginning of the 13 years of ritual, mental, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. I could see now that it was all carefully orchestrated by Doc. He had already systematically gained access to me and brutally attacked me without my parents' knowledge, so that all he had to do was capitalize on the pre-existing emotional gap between my parents and me. Pedophile sociopaths are opportunists who target ostracized children. So it was a fatal emotional dynamic between my family and me that opened the door for Doc to weasel his way into my life. He gained regular access to me, unfettered by reestablishing a friendly relationship with my mother, which was easily done because he already knew her casually through the community. He managed to convince both my parents that he knew everything about the extrasensory gifts I was exhibiting and that he was the perfect mentor for me. Under Doc's sick plan, I very soon developed a dependence on him and his approval of me. This is a syndrome that has often been referred to as Stockholm Syndrome, and I truly believe that he was my real father. I believed everything he said. My parents felt I really did need help, and here was an intelligent man offering his assistance, an expert in these matters, and someone who was passionate about helping me. That's why my parents trusted him. My parents continued to worry about me, and he grown quite distressed about how chronically unhappy I was. And they knew I had no friends whatsoever. They had begun to accept that something was seriously wrong with me, but had no clue as to what was really causing it or what more they could do. They saw most of the red flags but misinterpreted them. And during my years with Doc, I exhibited many telling symptoms. I was injuring myself by cutting, so anytime I arrived home with injuries caused by Doc or another member of the cult, it was excused away as self-injury or an accident that I had with the horses. When I was acting as if I was in an altered mental state because of the drugs that Doc had been administering to me, or if my mind or mood was off because of my extrasensory abilities, it was explained away as a schizoaffective disorder. When I displayed extreme separation anxiety well past the appropriate phase of development in childhood and withdrew socially, making no friends at all, it was explained away as shyness. When I would hoard food in my room, my parents explained it away as a personality quirk. When I wouldn't play like other kids but preferred to be obsessively perfect in whatever task I was set on performing, usually an athletic one, they explained it away as me being a talented perfectionist. When I wrote dark, disturbed poetry or drew disturbing pictures, they assumed I was overly sensitive and had been affected by someone else who was being abused at my school. When I kept getting bacterial infections and urinary tract infections, stomach pain so bad I was hospitalized, and migraines, they attributed it to a weak immune system or a hormonal imbalance. When I was 13, a friend of my mother's who was an RN examined me, only to discover that my hymen was not intact. After asking my mother if I was sexually active and being told no, she explained it away as potentially being the result of years of horseback riding. New section. How could such horrendous abuse be missed? Sure enough, all the symptoms that I showed as a child and teenager were caused by the abuse, were attributed to something else, and the ways described above, or to me. Ow, dude, my hand is locking up. Holding this book is actually kind of heavy, and like holding it with one hand is painful. I might have to chill with that. Alright. The only thing is I'm like trying to read it with this thing here, and it's like kind of cutting off my vision, but I think I can read it without having to hold it up. Alright. Being mentally, sorry, let me recap. Sure enough, all the symptoms that I showed as a child and teenager were caused by the abuse, were attributed to something else in the ways described above, or to me being mentally ill. My parents thought I had a mental illness that no psychologist or psychiatrist would diagnose. Don't get me wrong, psychiatrists and psychologists diagnosed me plenty. It's just that they all disagreed on my diagnosis because my symptoms didn't fit the mold of any one form of mental illness. Sexual abuse was mentioned several times as a potential issue by psychologists, but upon seeing that neither of my parents were perpetrators, they were forced to move on to other potential explanations. The idea that I could be getting abused by someone whom my parents trusted was simply outside of everyone's reality. I don't know if they even considered it at the time. It was a notion that seems as far-fetched as an alien abduction. All this time I was terrified to admit to anyone that this was all Doc's doing and that I was completely under his control. The sicker and more unhappy I got, the more Doc would come to the rescue, suggesting that I spend more time with him and that he knew what to do to help me. From my parents' perspective, it seemed that all the adults around me in my childhood, including them and Doc, were sincerely working to try to figure out what was wrong with me and fix it. In this way, my parents would let Doc spend more and more time with me because they were desperate about what could be done to help me, and they were desperate to find someone who could show me how to cope with my unusual brain. I think in some way the idea of having so much control over me that he could do all of it right under my parents' noses was what gave him even more excitement. Like an addiction, Doc had to keep increasing and increasing the level of deception and risk to get the same high. The same went for his need to increase the level of his violence, and that put me in situations of ever increasing danger and terror. To spare you the graphic details, I'll just summarize quickly what happened from age 6 to 19. I was tortured physically and sexually in cult rituals, raped, deprived of food, and forced to undergo 3 abortions, all performed by Doc himself, who was also the father. I was photographed for how do I pronounce this here? Sadomasochistic pornography sold to men for sex in outdoor gas stations, bathrooms, and kept in basements and in a hole in the ground in Doc's backyard. I was also exposed to electroshock programming, forced to undergo isolation torture, and left overnight tied up in lava caves in southern Idaho. What the fuck? Lava caves? What the hell? I didn't even know that kind of shit was even in Idaho. That's crazy. During this time, I was drugged chronically by Doc with anesthetics, all of which he had unlimited access to due to being a veterinarian by trade. I was chased through the Idaho and Utah wilderness by Doc playing tracking games in which he would hunt me, and I would undergo consequences like having my rib cage cut or being raped if I was caught. And I was used as a lure to other children who ended up being hurt and on occasion killed. Jesus Christ. New segment. Finally, a mistake opens up to an escape. I was a shell of a person. I was a cutter, and I was disassociated most of the time. I had attempted suicide and was still suicidal. I had believed for 13 years that my family was in fact not my real family, that my life with them was a facade. I lived with the guilt of the belief that I had stolen the life of their real child. I believed that I was evil. I believed that if I told any of them about my real life with Doc, they would all be brutally murdered. After exhausting every single option they could think of to try to get me help, my parents knew what was going on with me, and so utterly powerless about what to do with me that they had all but given up. But then when I was 19 years old, Doc made a mistake. It was the first mistake he'd made in 13 years. He made a mistake with the dosage of an anesthetic drug that he was administering to me. He had intended to drug me to the point that he could convince me that I had done something that I hadn't done. But the misdosage resulted in me retaining memory that I didn't want. But the misdosage resulted in me retaining memory that I didn't do what he said I had done. Finally, my head was clear enough to think to myself, if Doc is lying about this, what else has he lied about? I couldn't come up with any reason for him to convince me that I had done something that I hadn't actually done, other than to scare me into total powerless dependency. The realization came on the heels of his mistake with the dosage, and I finally found a chance to escape, and I did. I escaped that very same night to the sanctuary of a man who I had met only twice. His name was Blake, and I had met him as a result of my mother trying to expand my non-existent social circle as a teenager. She had connected with a family whose son, not Blake but another boy, was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. It was my mother's idea that perhaps if we found another teen with a mental illness, I might feel some kind of connection and be less alone. I had attended a party with this new acquaintance of mine, and as I went to open the front door of the house where the party was being held, a willowy-looking young man, full of enthusiasm, said hi as he propelled himself over the railing and into some bushes. I thought to myself, what an idiot. But when he came back inside and we made eye contact for the first time, I found his eyes and his essence to be so familiar and so pervasively kind that we were inseparable that night. We ended up going skinny dipping in a reservoir with a group of other teenagers, and something in me felt a palpable camaraderie. I knew that he was so pure and innocent that I could trust him completely. The night I fled from Doc's control, the only safe place I could think was to go was Blake's house. I had been there only once. When he said he wanted to show me his hacky sack collection that night, Blake wasn't home, and neither were his two roommates. But I was in such a state of distress that I broke in through a window and knew no other way to cope with the distress than to cut myself. When Blake returned, he was shocked to find me in his bathtub with blood spilling down the drain. He cleaned me up, bandaged my cuts, and told me to stay with him. And I did. I had no real plan to run away from Doc forever. I didn't think that was an option, but I stayed with Blake for a day. And a day became 2 days, and 2 days became a week, and by the end of the month, I never wanted to return. I was hiding. I talked to my parents on occasion and told them who I was with, but not where I was. Blake didn't know at first why I was so obviously disturbed and tortured, and mercifully, he didn't even ask. But he was so devoted to my very whim that I started to get better, gradually emerging from my emotional hell. And that is the end of Chapter 2, a very wild ride, a very graphic, crazy, shitty ride. That is a lot to take in. So I've heard, like I said, I've heard her backstory quite a few times, but I haven't really been able to read the full thing. Like I remember hearing other stories about some of the things that happened, like how some of the other children that were also being abused got killed. Like I remember hearing a story about that, which is just absolutely crazy. It's wild because, you know, when it comes to children, people really don't want to even fathom that something like this is even possible. People want to think that, you know, when it comes to children, for the most part, everybody's, you know, everybody treats children with respect, and, you know, but this stuff goes on. This stuff is real, and I know it might sound like evil you can't even dream of, but it actually happens. So yeah, that is proof of it right there. But anyway, that's chapter 2. So, you know, it's gonna get better from here. Like if that was too wild for you, it'll be better, a little bit better in chapter 3. So yeah, I believe chapter 3 will probably be the last sort of backstory chapter, and then we'll kind of get into the nitty gritty. So like I said, since I really want to get into like the main core and contents of the book, hopefully I can get into that with the first chapter for next week, but there will be one more chapter. Hopefully I'll be able to upload it before the end of this week, so by Sunday. So whenever you're watching this, hopefully the third chapter uploaded reading should be uploading and almost ready to go. So yeah, let me know what you guys think of this chapter in the comments below. Let me know if you have any thoughts about anything. And yeah, I'll see you guys very soon with chapter 3. Take care.